Peter McMillan, the Chief Executive Officer at NT Shelter, and welcome to another episode of Sharing the Couch. We're recording today from the lands of Larrakia people here in Darwin, and I'd like to pay my respect to their elders past and present, and also to any other First Nations people who may be watching or listening in today. Welcome. Today, it's a real pleasure to be speaking to Kasy Chambers, the Executive Director at Anglicare Australia, who has worked there for the past 15 years. Kasy is an accomplished CEO with extensive national experience in government and the community sector. She brings widespread hands-on experience in policy, advocacy, government relations, service provision, community development, corporate governance and finance. Her past roles include Manager Communications and Government Relations at Uniting Care Australia, Assistant Secretary in the Australian Government Department of Family Community Services and Indigenous Affairs, Executive Director, YWCA of Canberra, and Senior Policy Advisor with ACOS. She was also Executive Officer of the Resource Unit for Children with Special Needs in Western Australia. Kasy has had numerous board positions, including as member of the Not-for-Profit Sector Reform Council and the Public Affairs Commission of the General Synod. Kasy holds an honours degree in psychology, a master's in business administration, and a graduate diploma in ethics, and has undertaken the Strategic Perspectives in Non-Profit Management course at Harvard. Welcome, Kasy Chambers, to Sharing the Couch.
Thank you. That's a bit of a mouthful. Thank you. And can I start by acknowledging that I'm on the lands of the Ngunnawal people and pay my respects to their elders past and present, and also to those of the Narragain and the Ngambri people who traded on and passed through these lands, and to all First Nations people who might be listening or watching this broadcast.
Kasy, thanks for joining us. And I'm really curious as to your pathway to be Executive Director at Anglicare Australia, having had a background, I understand it, in veterinary management, farm management early on, as we talked about before we came on air, and I guess also, professional qualifications in psychology and elsewhere. What was the pathway for you when you were leaving school and wanting to go to university? What was going through your mind as to what you wanted to do back in those days?
Well, my pathway from the veterinary area to this was very simple. I was basically too thick to be a vet, which is what I started to want to be. And whilst I had the practical skills, I didn't have the nous to get the 4 A's in physics, chemistry, biology and maths that you needed. And so I did psychology because I'm absolutely fascinated in how we work, basically. And while I was at university doing psychology in Liverpool, I took up some voluntary work, and I worked in what was called, and this is just the most dreadful name, and as I've done more thinking, I've realised how bad this was, but it was called the Crypt Night Shelter in Liverpool. It was in the crypt of the Catholic cathedral there, and it was working with homeless men. We had beds for about 52 homeless men in one great big dormitory. It was the real basic wrong of, now looking back, what I realise. The men came in, were admitted from 6 to 6:30 in the evening, and then couldn't leave until 9 the next morning. They would farewell their women folk. There was no homelessness provision at that level for women in Liverpool at that time, and the women would often sleep rough in the grounds of the cathedral and things. But that probably ignited in me, a passion for thinking about, well, where are we with the people who have absolutely nothing, and probably kick-started me along that way of a more people-focused career. So when I finished my degree, I worked in another homelessness hostel, which was specifically for people who were homeless on release from prison or statutory care, including what we now know as out-of-home care. Went from there to drugs and alcohol, from there to disability, and then sort of started to climb the greasy pole of management as well. So that was all hands-on until then. Emigrated to Australia, and here I am now. And it's a very privileged position to be in, because I find myself able to be talking with practitioners and people who are experiencing services about services that I've done hands-on, that I've run, and then talking into government about those services and about the situations people find themselves in and why those services do and don't work. So it's when I looked at my career a couple of years ago, I thought, gosh, I've been dotted around because there's been other bits and pieces as well. But now when I look at it, it leads me, I think, very clearly to here, and it makes a very sensible journey and does enable me to really give some, I guess, to assist in telling those stories into federal government and assist in making those voices heard.
Kasy, you said you came from England or from the UK. Did you come straight to Western Australia? Is that the job you had working with children with disability, or did you do something else?
I came and did bought the combi, did the year. I worked on a gold mine in the Northern Territory. I worked on a manganese mine in Western Australia. I worked on a dive boat out at Cairns. I picked apples in the Huon Valley in Tasmania, and I worked on a racehorse stud in Victoria. So I do congratulate myself on doing the right thing in the right places with that one. But yeah, then when I came back out to settle, I did settle in WA and started with what was called the Resource Unit for Children with Special Needs, which was really around very young children in early childhood settings, and really assisting those settings to be welcoming and appropriate for all children, including those with disabilities, including children from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds, and including Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children.
I'm interested, Kasy, having come from the United Kingdom and doing work of a similar nature in Australia when you did settle down into professional work, whether there are any differences I know the cultures between Australia and the United Kingdom are quite similar in many respects, but there may be differences in terms of the way poverty is perceived or tackled. Did you notice anything different when you came to work professionally in Australia in terms of the way, I guess, people consider poverty or disadvantage and expectations of what can be done for people in those situations?
I think that's a really interesting question. So I'm answering it off the cuff in a way because I haven't answered it before. And so I do apologise that these are my observations and may not be true or correct. I was really horrified when I came to Australia the first time. I came with my understanding that this was a land that had been inhabited for many thousands, tens of thousands of years by First Nations peoples. And when I got here, not every white person seemed to share that view. And I was really shocked that a lot of even services for First Nations people seem to be similar to services for migrants, and seem to be treating people as just different racially, rather than this absolutely, to me, fundamental difference, which is that you haven't arrived in a different country, you've had other people arrive in your country and change it on top of you. And that seemed to me to be a really big difference in how we operated. In Britain, we didn't have that same kind of, flavour. But it really struck me that whilst I had that view, a lot of other people, including many officials, didn't. I had lots of conversations with officials, government officials, whereby it was we've got to look after the different racial groups. Whereas, as I say, I felt it was a different thing to be colonised and to be taken over than it was to simply only be a different racial group. And I don't want to downplay what it is like there to be a different racial group within a main society, but it didn't seem to take consideration of that in how we work. I do think that's changing now, latterly. What else was different? It did take me a long time to get my head around all the different levels of government, I have to say. I was probably lucky to land in Western Australia in that, in Western Australia, we are different. It is different, So the state government does play. It feels like a slightly different state, and because it has that, you do get used to thinking about state government and Commonwealth government and local government. But that's probably the two things that really stand out for me. I do have to say also, I'm very conscious that in moving to Australia, there were a lot of moves going on for me. So I moved from Britain to Australia. I moved from my 20s to my 30s. I probably moved from almost a working class background to almost a middle class way of living. And I moved from hands-on to management. So there were a lot of things that were changes for me at that time. So in talking about them, I can never really view, is that the difference between Australia and Britain, or the difference between a rural community and finding myself in a metro community, or the difference between management and coalface. So I do have to acknowledge that.
Kasy, also, I guess I'm mentioning that you landed in WA and your previous work with mining as well in the lead up to that. I guess it's interesting also in WA about the royalties for region scheme that they have, and the notion that there is that investment stream from Lotteries West into, I guess, social infrastructure, whether they be things like youth foyers or just simple bridges or accessibility infrastructure. That plays quite another important source of, I guess, funding for helping tackle disadvantage and access to services and things that maybe some of the other states don't have. Do you have any thoughts in terms of the way they do that sort of stuff in Western Australia? Is there that kind of that license to operate that mining companies have as part of royalties, and diverting some of that revenue back into social infrastructure?
Yeah, I probably have to confess it's not a conflict of interest, but my first job was funded by the Lotteries Commission. So my first Australian professional job, as opposed to mining and farm handing and things. But yeah, I think that part of WA structure and culture is really envied by the rest of the country. You know, there are always those concerns. I've done a lot of work in the UK with money from the Guinness Foundation, which, you know, you can see as it's money from alcohol. It's going to a good place, but is it coming from harm? I'm not picking out the Guinness Foundation now. I'm picking out any of those. And yeah, we can have arguments, or we can have conversations about what extent the Lotteries Commission encourages gambling. It was always interesting to me that it didn't encompass some of those more harmful forms of gambling of pokies. They were illegal in Western Australia. Probably the only area I ever agreed with Premier Richard Court on. And of course, we didn't have online gambling then either, which is becoming a massive problem. But certainly the Lotteries Foundation and Commission, when I worked there, was very, very helpful. There was a lot more co-design. We probably didn't call it that then, but in terms of listening and working with the sector and thinking about what went in. We had a wonderful network across WA of what were called Lotteries Houses. The organisation I ran had you know, some small one-worker projects in Karratha, at Port Hedland, Geraldton, Albany. It's very hard to be a one-worker model. Lotteries Houses really assisted with that. You had a lot of single workers. You know, you might have one for the Resource Unit for Children with Special Needs, you might have one for Down Syndrome, Western Australia, you might have one for the Make-A-Wish Foundation. Not only could they actually offer each other some security and safety and knowledge that someone else in the building, and share boardrooms and things, it really did, I guess, incubate some good relationships. So those Lotteries Houses were really a jewel in the crown, I think, and something that we have, you know, we would not do ourselves any harm to emulate in other places, regardless of the funding. That hub model, particularly, the Lotteries Houses haven't really done it, but I would love to see them around some form of a community centre, you know, whether that be a long daycare or a play group that's used at other times for men's sheds, you know, that kind of thing, with then that Lotteries House arrangement around them. That's something I think that particularly regional communities could really, really benefit from having in their community.
Absolutely, it's certainly got a part to play, and it kind of strikes me a little bit of interest that the role that plays in getting things built or provided that might not happen otherwise from government alone. I'm curious about the role that government plays, and increasingly, I guess, conversation these days about finding other forms of funding, whether it be institutional investors or elsewhere. And I guess going back a little bit from that is some of the things that you said before about Australian views or attitudes to, I guess, people in poverty, and that, over time in Australia, we seem to be increasingly comfortable with the idea that people can be left behind, as you compare to the 19th century notion of the deserving and undeserving poor being revived. I do also sense that from time to time in terms of two-speed economies and the like that you've also commented on. What's happening in Australian society at the moment, do you think, in terms of the way people are feeling about homelessness or poverty, and whose role they see as addressing that and fixing it?
Yeah, I think this is one of the other differences I forgot to mention when you asked me the question earlier about the difference between, or some of the differences I perceive between Britain and Australia. Australia can view itself in white terms as a new country, or a newish country, a young country. And so I think sometimes there's more of that sense of anyone can achieve anything, and therefore a sense that if you're not achieving something, you're to blame for it. So I do sometimes sense more of a sense of that. I always find it disappointing that we waste good crises. And during my time in Anglicare, I just started when we had the global financial crisis. Now we've just had the pandemic. During those times, we do seem to realise that we're all in this together. We have a greater sense of that. We do seem to grow a greater sense of our own frailty and vulnerability, that many in the middle in particular are only one paycheck or two paychecks or one relationship breakdown or one missed rental payment, whatever it is. I do have a sense that we're moving quite quickly away from that as we pull out of the pandemic, that we forget some of the compassion that we have in, that we grow during those times. Yeah, we had a sense that essential workers, they weren't the bankers, they weren't the hedge funders, they were the supermarket shelf fillers, they were the nurses, they were the aged care workers, they were the transport workers. They really are the people who are the lowest paid, who we see constantly with vulnerabilities in the housing market. There was a sense of that here and in Britain. People clapped the NHS, people, we stood out, I don't know what it was, did people stand out and put their dustbins out on a particular night and kind of show solidarity for aged care workers and things. I fear that we're moving back away from that, and I fear that we're moving back to that sense that, people's poverty is their own issue. I do think that most of us here in Australia don't actually know how little people get through welfare benefits. So there is a sense, I think, that as Australians we have a weird kind of jealousy of people who might be on welfare benefits. So there's a strange envy that if we actually talk to people about, did you know that, job seeker is this amount per year? Did you know that this is the kind of level? Most people don't realise that. And I think there's a role for us in the sector to keep on, rather than just talking about job seeker or the age pension, to talk about what those amounts are, because what we've found is that in our survey work is that most people don't know how little they are, and when they do find out how little those benefits are, they do tend to change their attitudes slightly and more over time as to how people on welfare benefits should get extra help. So I do think there's the attitudes to poverty that we have, I think, tend to be a little bit blameworthy, but I think that we can do a lot of work around that in just letting people know, that nobody on job seeker is having surfing holidays. No one's sitting there having steak every night. It's just not possible.
No, and it's interesting also, isn't it, for those of us who work in the sector, when we hear stories, when we meet people, when we get an understanding of why people are in poverty, we develop a better appreciation of people's, I guess, backstories and how they've got to that point. And it's understandable and explainable. And maybe still there's I guess it's what people are connected to, what they're reading, and whether they know people in those situations, whether there's that empathy or simply a concept that you wrote about in the conversation back in 2015, I found really interesting, and that was where you referred to the double meaning of care. Can you maybe explain for us what you were referring to then?
Gosh, 2015 seems like a long time ago, Peter. and I clearly haven't done the same research for this that you have. But I think that there's a couple of things there. I mean, one is I did want to just say that I think all societies are changing, and we do have a greater ability to now pick who we talk to. We don't have incidental conversations quite so much. So we don't know people who aren't like us as much. And I think, knowing people who aren't like us, knowing people who are living long job seek, and knowing people who have a different political opinion to us, knowing people who are having a hard time does help. I do think that helps our empathy. 2015, wow. So I think, that there's, I'm just trying to struggle. This is where we talked about the fabric of society, and is that the one?
Yeah, where you were referring, sorry, it wasn't meant to be a quiz.
No.
That's a little bit mean. We don't.
I should have done my homework.
No, not at all. No, we're referring to Australians, care on one level about the plight of Australians, perhaps by, I guess, reading an article, feeling sympathy or empathy, maybe engaging with a social media post. But that's one side of care. But the other side, actually taking action to affect real change, and I guess people taking that next step as to doing something about it that can lead to real change. Yeah.
And I think for me that is about owning some of those issues. We do need to deeply feel them. It is a bit easy to push a like or a support or vote something up. To actually do something about it can be much harder. And it is much harder to stop and have a chat with someone, to bring them into your life, to start to understand their life when it may be very, very different to ours. And I think that is something that we do need to do. Like I say, it is very easy to not know people. To have no one in your social circle who isn't like you. Our suburbs are built around being able to drive your car straight from the road, virtually into your house, because the garage is attached to your house. You don't necessarily have to talk to your neighbours. You don't have to talk to someone on the bus next to you, those kind of things. And that's not to say that we always did that and it was always better. But certainly I think that there is more of a difficulty for us now, even if we genuinely want to know and get out and know lots of different people. But to actually take that care and to take that responsibility, I do think that there is an issue, even with democracy. We have been schooled in the last 4 years, I believe, to think that democracy is having a vote every 3 years and using that. I think that makes us very lazy, and I think it drops responsibility. And I think our larrikin kind of conversation about politicians, that's politics, that's Canberra, that's whatever. On the one hand, that's fun, and that kind of level of disrespect and evenness is quite an Australian characteristic, and that's great. But on the other hand, by saying that, we are actually letting people off. And, if we live in a democracy, we need to own those politicians. We need to be responsible for their behaviour, and we need to be responsible for much more than just voting every 4 or 3 years. We really do need to take care, know what's going on, take the care to actually look at what things are like for people. What is it like for 2 15-year-olds, one who is finishing school in Nhulunbuy and one who's finishing school in Surrey Hills? What's happening there? I was very, very touched by my colleague, and I know he's previously sat on this virtual couch, but Dave Pugh, who retired at the end of last year, he made a very insightful comment, which was that he was the same age as Archie Roach. Archie Roach had just passed away, and Dave was looking forward to the next third of his life in retirement. That is simply the difference, because some of where people came from and where they were born, and that was the point Dave was making, I believe. And I think people getting a handle on that this isn't luck that we have built ourselves. This isn't something that we have been entitled to because we somehow graduated year 12. This has been a lottery that put us in the, in a family that had access to a school that did year 12, or this is inherited wealth almost that has enabled us to do many of these things. So I do think that's the kind of care and responsibility we need to take, which is probably not quite what I said in 2015, but that's probably my evolving thoughts around that. And I've certainly been thinking a lot about the nature of democracy and that kind of our responsibility as ants in that process, that we have a lot of responsibility for that democratic well-being.
It's very interesting, isn't it? And I guess if we look at the term, that the Canberra bubble, I mean, if there is such a bubble, it needs to be broken down, doesn't it? It's just like a lot of us in real life maybe live in our own bubbles, disconnected from what's happening for Aboriginal First Nations people or people in regional areas, for example. We're all really connected, and I guess these constructs of bubbles are really isolating people and thinking from reality, really, when we look at that connectedness. And absolutely for people representing their constituencies going down to Canberra to make policy that affects Australians' lives, it's really important not to go into a bubble environment that by nature is detached from reality, really.
Yeah.
So it's fascinating. Kasy, I'd like to turn to Anglicare Australia and maybe just get you to tell us a little bit about Anglicare Australia, and then I'd like to focus a little bit, if we can, on the work that you do at Anglicare Australia and across the Anglicare network in speaking up for the people that you work with through policy and advocacy. But 15 years is quite some time in Anglicare Australia in that role. Obviously, there's a lot of things that really are satisfying to you and rewarding to you, and no doubt challenging in the work that you're trying to undertake there. Can you tell us a bit about Anglicare Australia for those of us who might not be familiar with the Anglicare structure?
Sure. I mean, the biographical detail on it is really that it's 34 individual organisations. They are all each individually governed. They have grown from their communities, and they do many different things, but they come together through a sense of who they are, of the values that they have, and they form a network called Anglicare Australia. Together, that network's quite large. It has quite a broad footprint. There's very few communities that we don't have a presence in, that we don't partner with. It's about 29,000 staff and volunteers, for example. 1 in 19 Australians use our services at some stage. But it really comes together out of a sense that there is more than providing good service. That's really important. If we're going to do something, we need to do it well. We can always do it better, but there is a real need to provide service to people that recognises them as individuals, that says to them you are cared about, that says to them you are here, you are recognised, we know your name, something as simple as that. But we come together to go further than that, to talk about why it is that we need to do services in the first place. There'll always be a need for a quick trampoline. That night shelter I spoke of when I first started work, the idea of that was it was for people who'd missed the train home or needed 2 nights accommodation here or there. It wasn't that. By the time I got there, it had been in operation for many, many years, and it was actually where people lived full time. So for Anglicare, we exist as well to really be thinking about why is it that these services are needed? How could these services be changed? How can we actually change society so we build it better? And so that's what actually really brings us together. Our kind of catchphrase, or my little catchphrase, is that we've got national strength but local responsiveness. So each individual organisation that's within the Anglicare family has grown with different service responses to different groups of people in what they saw as the need at different times. But together, we come together to really try to enable the voices of those who are most disadvantaged to be heard, and to actually have conversations and lead thoughts about what would make a more just society.
I think it's extraordinary when I read that Anglicare's agencies network works with 1 in 40 Australians. That's a huge presence across our communities right across Australia. And also the notion that services are there are generally funded by Australian governments to deliver programs and services on its behalf, on government's behalf, I guess under a contract or funding arrangement. But also, I guess, the need in your vision to speak out on behalf of the people that you do work with. So I know a lot of non-government organisations might struggle with that around undertaking the front end grind of supporting people in need, doing the tough yards, but also maybe getting caught up working in that service delivery space, maybe not seeing it either as their role or maybe seeing it as perilous to be speaking out around what's needed and maybe even being a bit critical. Anglicare does seem to do that quite well, but how do you, I guess, juggle that the risk of being too, I guess, critical or aggressive around what needs to be done, especially when you see things that aren't effective, versus, I guess, getting on and doing your day-to-day service delivery work across Australia? How do you juggle those, I guess, competing tensions?
I think that is an ongoing tension for all of our organisations. I am very, very lucky in that we are funded by our network to really do some of that work. There is a balance. I mean, my own view is that in taking that voice and being, I guess, trusted with that voice, that we make sure that it is really well evidenced, that we build evidence, that we bring stories, that if possible, we enable people to speak for themselves, but where that might not be possible, or where the story of one person doesn't actually tell the whole kind of story, that we bring those together and build evidence. There's a sense for me that, it's about civil engagement. I don't believe that anyone is in politics for any bad reason. Everybody wants to do the best. I think it's contrary to some popular opinion. It is not well paid. If you work to get on an hourly rate, it isn't well paid. And I think people are here for the best of intentions. So for us to do that, it's about respecting that. It's about enabling people without challenging them. I think you can paint people into corners and you'll never get them back out of there. So it's about taking evidence. It's about working with people to understand what it is that systems are doing. It's about not placing blame. I guess the saying, the sporting analogy is play the ball, not the person, or something. So it's always that. But it does mean that there are times where we will disagree with a side of politics that might believe we should be on their side. That can be difficult. But what we do very clearly is we're very clear about what we think would work. We've got the evidence to show that, and that's what we just stick by. And then we can judge policies, we can judge things that come in after that. We can judge budgets and things against that. So there is that sense of making sure that you do know that you're on solid ground. And one of the things we try to do is to never ever be an ivory tower think tank. We do not stick our necks out anywhere where we don't have the evidence from the expertise of the people that we work with. Those people are expert in their own stories and their own lives. That's really what we use to build that evidence. The other thing is that certainly for Anglicare, and we're not alone in this, but for Anglicare especially as a charity that has a faith base and a philosophy, this isn't about providing the best hotel room. That's really important. I've just got back from a holiday, and it's great when people are after doing the best that they can do. I'm sitting today at the supermarket. The man who runs that supermarket, it's really important to him to have the best fresh produce at the best times. This is something different to that. This isn't just about offering the best aged care experience. Of course it's that, but it's also about talking about why Why do we need to do this? Why is it that we have to have the best homelessness hostels for young people? Why is it that we need to be thinking about how we work with young people from First Nations families who find themselves in out-of-home care? What is it that's behind that? What could we do differently so that that doesn't happen? And I guess it fits very, very neatly with the Anglican Church's two of their marks of mission around loving service, which is clearly, making sure what we do is good and recognises the individual. It's not, it's not just about that service. But actually the one that I find myself most engaged with is calling out unjust structures and challenging those. And so that's that part of that advocacy work. I think, I've said that we're non-partisan. I've said that we play the ball, not the person. But the last government, the Morrison government, it was very hard to work with as charities. There was clearly a bit of a war on charities, and that fact of being able to stick our heads again above the parapet. We were very lucky. Our board and our membership said keep doing that, and as we're seen as a bit more of an establishment charity than some, so we were able to do that. But it strikes me as a very weak government or a very weak leader that doesn't want to hear constructive criticism. And so I would challenge any government to listen to charities. We are often on the ground with people. We can breathe in and out pretty quickly. And we're often the fabric of a local community as well. Those lotteries houses that we talked about earlier, they have boards of ordinary local people. They might be service users, but they might also just be people that live in the house nearby. That's the way that we can better tie up our democracy and tie those politicians back in. So I do think there's a very weak leadership that doesn't want that kind of criticism. And it is down to us who sit in that role of advocacy to make that advocacy hearable and understandable in ways that isn't easy to bat off. So strong evidence, a strong voice, but not combative.
I think you probably captured some of the elements of this already, but I know that there's an appetite for member organisations that we work with to want to co-design programs and work closely with government as partners. I know at times that might be seen as risky, and I know you've worked in government before in senior roles and obviously in the community sector. Can you just run through maybe some of the competing risks from both sides, perhaps, as to why that might be good in theory, but might be difficult to pull off effectively, that really working as trusted partners on reform, whether it be homelessness reform, where we're working through an evidence-based way of restructuring service delivery, or some other form of reform. The intention seems to me to be there, that those of us who work, I guess, with people directly, who have that first-hand knowledge and experience, and government on the other hand, who I guess has to work within an authorising environment as well. How can we, I guess, proceed regardless of trust, whether the trust's there or not, whether those relationships are as strong as they could be otherwise? Have you got any thoughts around that? How the sector can work effectively with government? What an effective model might look like?
I think there are some intrinsic difficulties in that relationship. It is an uneven partnership, and we need to acknowledge that. One side has the money and the other side doesn't. The need for probity and things for government often looks like a lack of transparency to the other side, and so that there are those difficulties. And I think we have to name them up. I think not admitting the elephant in the room doesn't help us. So I think we need to name those. I think it's a good time to name those. The public service is coming out of a long time now where it has been devalued, where its advice has not been sought, and where really its role has been run down. A lot of the work has been outsourced to private companies. We've got accounting companies who now own most of the knowledge about what Australians think about X, Y, or Z, or how a program worked or didn't work. And we've got public servants who are very good at managing contracts and haven't had the opportunity to do a lot of other things. So I do think that there's some opportunity there. There is very, very few people in my experience who have worked in senior levels in both sectors. I was certainly the only one in FAXIA at the time. That there's a few people, but I think we could do a lot to enable that. It's got to be more than a transactional sort of secondment, but that's difficult. You hit all kind of difficulties around long service leave and this and that. So we've got to get around that. And in fact, I'm having a conversation with the Deputy Secretary shortly about how we can do some of that, because I think the time is right. So I do think that there's some ripeness of time. The government, the people in the public service can be quite removed from the people who are utilising those services. This is, what people talk about as being the Canberra bubble, but public servants aren't stupid, and so if we've got some ways of building evidence and telling stories and getting that information in, that's probably our responsibility to do, definitely. There is also a sense, and again, it comes back to some conversations about democracy. There's still quite a sense of gotcha moments. And so if you are living in fear of those, it's quite hard to work in a collaborative way. And so I think, government does need to stand back a little bit, government and opposition, and have some joint goals. I know that's pretty hard, but I know when I was in government, Senate estimates was seen to be the big performance area, and you really didn't want to let anything slip, which doesn't really help the opposition. If we're talking about, let's be honest, let's look at what we're doing well, what we're not doing well. Let's have some ideas about how we could do that better. So I think there's some real cultural things which do drive this divide. There are some real elephants in the room that are about unevenness. So I think we, in acknowledging both of those, we can then come and say, okay, what can we bring? What can you bring? And how do we, how can we best now devise a service that fits people's needs, and a service that we can understand where it has its effect. Which bit do we need to dial up a bit at possibly low cost and get some good results? Which bits, we could dial up and put as much money in as we wanted, but it's not going to drive much improvement. But if we could come to understand those things, then that would be really, really helpful. So I think co-design is a great way forward. I think we've just got to be careful that we don't see it as the next sort of panacea, call everything by it, and ignore what real true co-design is, because co-design, if we do it properly, as everyone watching this will know, it's really hard work. We can't ever say we've done it. We can't say we've ticked it off. We need to keep going back and keep looking at what we're doing right, what we're doing wrong. Are we talking to the right people? Are we talking to someone who went through the service 5 years ago? Or are we only talking to people in it at the time? All those kind of questions. So I do think there's some stuff we can do. I think the time is ripe. Prime Minister Albanese has talked about reinvigorating the public service, and I really do hope that happens in a meaningful way, and I think it can do, and I think we in the sector can assist that. But I do think we need to all be aware that there are different pressures, and that we probably, if we want to do this, need to stop watching the news of a night time for the gotcha moments, because they're not compatible with this form of working together.
Absolutely. And Kasy, also this nature of co-opetition that I've heard used sometimes in terms of public bay or public sector, where organisations are competing for funding, but we also need to collaborate together to get outcomes for clients. That can be a tricky space sometimes for organisations to work through. As a leading national organisation, Anglicare, could you talk a bit about the importance, I guess, for our sector, whether it be in housing and homelessness or in disability or other sectors, how organisations can, I guess, where they should position themselves in terms of being collegial and collaborative with others who may be competing for the same grant funding next time around? How do you do that?
I think it's really, really hard, and I've been that CEO a couple of times in those kind of places. It's very difficult. You might, we've had For example, most Anglicare agencies put their hand on their heart and said that they wouldn't go for any employment service money a few years ago when the Howard government, brought the breaching in and stuff with it. In doing that, they lost a lot of capacity to impact and work with people of a working age. Other charities didn't stick by that. People make different choices. So I think there is some difficulty in doing that. I think it is there is an onus on us as a sector to work with the government and again help them to understand that we're not just providers of government services. We have our own identities, we have our own reasons for existence. We are not simply here to give them the best hotel room. I keep using hotel rooms because it's transactional, it's something we all use. But we're not simply here to do that. We all have our own reason for being. And there is a fabric that the not-for-profit and charitable sector gives us, where it's not just transactional. I guarantee that most people here, if you want to go and find something, you go to a library, you might go and find a not-for-profit group, your kids might be in Scouts, there's just all sorts of fabric things that hold a community together that are not part of simply getting in funding and spending it on something. And I think that that's something that we really need to work hard to help the government understand. I know that Minister Andrew Leigh, who now has charities in his portfolio, one thing that's very refreshing is he wanted charities in his portfolio, and that's great. But, to build that very deep understanding that this is something that in and of itself builds a better community. So it's not just necessarily that people who are vulnerable come and have a particular service through a play group. It's that play group builds lifelong friendships amongst those kids, amongst those parents. It enables us to get into groups of parents and chat about other things, whether it's a cancer prevention scheme that's coming to town the next week, or whether it's about getting ready for preschool or whatever. There's just a fabric there that takes us outside of pure transactions. Tendering puts us back into those pure transactions. So that I guess that's the knife edge. I do think that there are possibilities for organisations to form long-term relationships. The issue that a lot of organisations seem to come across is that a tender will be called, you might not find it 6 weeks at best, and you might not find out about it for a week. You've got to go through all your internal processes. That is not long enough to form a long-term relationship. So my thoughts are always that organisations should be spending time forming those relationships, strengthening the sector in which they sit. You don't get any money for sitting on the NT-COS board. Your organisation doesn't get paid for that. But in strengthening that sector, I do believe that you will actually, strengthen the fabric of the not-for-profit sector. The issue then is when we have areas like the NDIS or packages, user pays kind of systems. Yes, it puts more power into the individual, but it also, you cannot find a way if you can't put it into someone's NDIS package that you will sit on the NT-COS board or the National Disability Services board. But that I do believe is part of our responsibility as a sector. We need to be strengthening the sector. We need to be looking at what a strong sector looks like. And individual CEOs, I think it can sometimes be a luxury, but you start having those cups of coffee, you start looking at where you've got your commonalities, at those you can work with. And personally, I would never, ever advise a board I was reporting to go into a partnership with an organisation that I didn't know really, really well. Because your reputation, the well-being of your clients, everything is going in on that. And it might work on a 6-week contract, a 6-week tender process that you've been able to bring your contract together. But I really do think that those relationships should have started years ago.
Okay, so I think it's really, really well argued, and I think also probably add to that, especially if you're working with an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander organisation, those relationships are going to take time, and so we should, to build that trust. You mentioned there unpaid work, and there's also a lot of, I'd probably argue, a lot of underpaid work as well in the sector. When you look at the remuneration that frontline service staff receive compared to government peers, there are big disparities there. It is difficult structurally to attract and retain staff over long periods of time. Do you think our sector is, or a better question probably would be, what do you think is the prospects for a better, more professionally, better recognised, better funded sector where staff maybe are paid or recognised, at least remunerated in terms of the value that they bring to the economy? Because there are a lot of costs that are avoided by the work that the sector does. Do you think there's still some work to be done to, I guess, address what appears to me to be a sector that's maybe a little bit unloved and not well understood by government in terms of the work that we do?
I think you've hit the nail on the head there, Peter. I really do think that it's about us being better understood. If people understood the work that was done, and I think people got closer during the pandemic, you know, people actually started to get what aged care workers did, or what it meant. If we could be better understood, we might be better respected and therefore better supported. I do think that in recent years we have had a bit of a war on charities. We've had lots of narratives that have been about, you know, charities are fronts for terrorism, they're fronts for money laundering, that kind of stuff. There's really almost nothing that could be further from the truth. But in putting that narrative out there, it does, you know, it obviously people hear things and that sticks with them. And that view that the sector has been part of that has not been helpful. So I think we do need to blow our own trumpet a little bit. I think we do need to make it clearer to people what it is doing. You know, it's not just aged care. You don't go into childcare. You become an early educator because you have a passion, not just because that's what is left for you, you know. And yet those narratives still sometimes sit around. I think it's really important that we're proud of our sector. Every single time we do anything, we can see that CEOs are better qualified in our sector than any other sector. There is less fraud in our sector than any other sector, and yet people are paid less. So we really do need to look at what that work looks like and to value it. I do think that there is a bit of a gender lens. You know, much of the work has been seen as female work in the past. And I think it's upon us to say whether it is or it isn't female work, doesn't matter. It's actually about paying it correctly. And I also think that there's a narrative that constantly says we should not pay more taxes. That might be something we have to hit head on and say, if this is what the care you want in your older years, if this is the care you want for your grandmother, mother, father, uncle, yourself, this is what we'll need to pay for it. Because at the moment, there's a vast schism between what we will, as a country, pay for aged care and what we expect, for example. So I think there's quite a lot going on there. And there are, of course, other differentials that often aren't the things that are talked about. So again, to come back to public service, you know, that there are different superannuation models which really put people in very different places. And so it's not just about pay, that there are those other areas as well. And I think there's also that other area which you hit upon, which is volunteering. Volunteering is so valuable. It's valuable for the people that benefit from it. It's valuable for the people that do it. Right throughout my adult life, I've been a volunteer in so many different areas, and I've got so much out of it. It's not altruistic. It's completely selfish. I've got so much out of it, whatever it is I've done. And yet we have policies which are still driving against volunteering in a way. We still, as maybe not as a community, but as policy, see that a good way to spend your time is in economic development of some sort or other. That could be something that's harmful. It could be producing pornography or hedge fund or something, but that is more valuable than someone who volunteers in an environmental charity or in caring for elders or whatever it is. And one of my proofs of that is that we have driven in the last couple of years, it has been harder for people to utilise volunteering as a mutual obligation for their New Start, now job seeker, for example. And yet, you know, if we're trying to connect people, if we're trying to keep people in work, if we're trying to enable people to be part of things, what's better than, you know, my mum in the UK is at a charity shop today working. She loves it. And, you know, our charity shops, our op shops, as we call them here, they would not work without volunteers. And those volunteers get something out of it. And heck, we get a heck of a lot out of it. So that's another part. There's an invisibility of much of what the sector does. Similarly, and again, particularly things like parishes will often bring a lot of food to emergency relief services. So we might get money from federal government, we might get money from state government, but we also get a lot of produce and I guess in kind from people. And that comes back to us needing to be respected, needing to be clear about who we are, because you don't see people volunteering to work at Centrelink, you see them volunteering to work, you know, with services and with organisations that have a core story and a core reason for being.
Kasy, just to finish up, you've written in the past about being hopeful but not necessarily expectant. At key times when there were levies that were being looked at by the Abbott government, I guess in the past when we've had opportunities to have national housing and homelessness plans or direct investment in social and affordable housing. I remember during COVID, there were so many economists that said, look, the best investment governments can probably do during COVID is to invest in more social and affordable housing, and we've instead we spent a lot of money on I guess home improvement initiatives and things like that, which arguably wasn't money well spent. So as we enter 2023, the energy is clearly still there. I can see it, and you and the passion. It's wonderful after 15 years. But where do you see? Are you optimistic? Are you expectant? Are you hopeful about what we're seeing and what we're starting to hear about now, I guess, in terms of housing and tackling housing and homelessness? We haven't talked a lot specifically about that today, but that's okay. I'm just curious as to what you consider to be now, I guess, in your 16th year, as being the prospects for getting some stuff done. And are you optimistic?
I'm always optimistic, partially because I'm a little bit stupid. I'm the staffy, you know, if you have to choose what dog breed you are. But look, I do think we need to keep on we need to be really clear about what housing is. You know, we have a policy system that regards the building of housing. We've asked the market to take on all the heavy lifting for affordable housing. And we have policy settings which treat housing as development of wealth. We just need to keep naming that up. It's not about housing, it's about development of wealth. If we talk about housing, we talk about people's need for housing, then that becomes a lot realer, I think. I love being a little bit provocative and talking about the welfare benefits that flow through negative gearing and capital gains tax. They are welfare benefits. They're no different. And we did a piece of work a little while ago now. We're about to renew it, and we called it the cost of privilege, because we wanted to think about what does it actually cost us as a community to have these choices. Let's be really clear. This is a choice. Let's put some evidence out there that enables everyone to see what the choice is. I don't think the figures when we do them shortly are going to be any different. What we found was that when we looked at taxes and transfers in those kind of areas, in private schools, in superannuation concessions to the higher end, in negative gearing, in capital gains tax, what went out, what came together out of that was $138.6 billion. Yeah, it was huge. 6 billion flowed to the lowest 20%. Yeah, the rest was right up there. It is, you know, with both money and housing, we need to stop even thinking that trickle down anyone can have it in the back of their minds as something. It doesn't work. And that's why we're not talking about supply of housing. If we keep talking about supply of housing, that's about trickle down. We need to talk about social and affordable housing. We need to talk about what housing means to people, what it means to children in those families. And we do need to acknowledge that we're making a policy choice. When the pandemic hit, we doubled, and I've had a go at the Morrison government, so let me give them a bouquet. They doubled job seeker. We raised people out of poverty. And what was most telling for me and the most heartwarming stuff was that people on job seeker started to act like they had a future. We saw people buy a fridge to put their food in. We saw people undertake training because they believed there was a future. We saw people paint their bedroom, their child's nursery, because there was a future. There was something to plan for and look forward to. That's the difference. And I think it's on us to keep on saying this is a choice. Well, we choose to put that much money out to the highest income earners, we can't put it here. And I think we need to keep telling that story as we keep on having the debate about stage 3 tax cuts. Sure, we can do the stage 3 tax cuts, but it is a choice. And let's be conscious about the society and the Australia that we want.
You've been watching or listening to Kasy Chambers, the Executive Director at Anglicare Australia. Just like to also mention that Anglicare Australia releases annually a rental affordability snapshot, a jobs availability snapshot, and Australia Fair reports. And Kasy referred to evidence-based a number of times during the conversation, and just want to mention how important it is that those reports are issued and really put the spotlight on areas, whether it be the lack of housing that's affordable for people on low incomes, different income types that we generally look at and rely on in our advocacy as well. So Kasy, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you for the incredibly important work that Anglicare does right across Australia, and also that you're doing on a national level to really put an evidence-based spotlight on these issues and ultimately developing a fairer and better Australia, and addressing poverty and tackling housing and homelessness and all the myriad of other work that you do across Australia. Thanks again for joining us.
Well, thanks, Peter. Thanks for what you're doing and for actually sitting there and using your leadership to make me look a little bit good. So thank you.
Again, thank you, Kasy. And if you want to watch more of our podcast episodes, please don't forget to hit the subscribe button. Check us out on social media, or share if you think other people would benefit from conversations like the one we've had with Kasy and other ones which are coming up, which we'll be very excited to bring you shortly. Thanks again, and see you all next time.